components. Now, this webinar will provide an overview and explore the implications of the Basel Convention for e-waste management. We'll look at policy, guidelines, procedure, and partnerships to address challenges countries face in managing e-waste under the Convention's framework. Now, for this webinar, we have two esteemed panelists who will share their insights and expertise. And after our panel session, we will then proceed to our Q&A segment. Although please, you may ask questions anytime through the question box below in your screens. So without further ado, let's start with the panel. I am honored to introduce both our panelists who will be sharing a joint presentation to all of us. First, we have Carla Valle-Klann. Carla is a Program Manager Officer of the United Nations Environment Program, or UNEP, and is responsible for the areas pertaining to the Basel Convention technical guidelines and electronic approaches to the notification and movement documents. She leads the Technical Assistance Program and the E-Waste Program in the Secretariat of the Basel, Stockholm, and Rotterdam Conventions, or what we call BRS Conventions. And she has been with the United Nations since 2005 and has a background in computer science. Now, Carla will then be followed by Tatiana Terekhova. Tatiana is a Program Management Officer from the UNEP as well, and has a leading role in the Partnerships Program and Illegal Traffic and Trade under the BRS conventions. Tatiana implements capacity building activities, including in relation to marine pollution and plastic wastes, the implementation of the BRS conventions, and e-waste, of course. She has been with the UN for over 18 years and has a background in international environmental law. Now, Carla and Tatiana, we are very pleased to have you both all the way from Europe, from Geneva. Thank you so much, and you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Rocky, for inviting us, the ADB, for inviting us for this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Good afternoon. I don't know if there is good evening also, people in the call. So I'll start the presentation and Tatiana will continue. So I'll share my screen now. Let's see here. Bear with me just a sec. Can you confirm that you can see the screen, please?
You can see it, Carla. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, in our presentation, we are going to give an overview about e-waste in relation to the Basel Convention. So I will start, and as I said, Tatiana will continue. We share activities in the Secretariat related to e-waste together with other colleagues. And this is just an awareness-raising presentation for you so that you understand what we are doing, what's happening in that area. So from the motivational point of view, why we discuss all these topics continuously. From the case of e-waste, different than other waste streams, but also similar to other waste streams, it's one waste stream that has high recycling value, and the recycling possibilities is an economically viable one and also attractive because several materials can be recovered and new products can be developed. Examples of parts of e-waste that can be of recycling target are plastics, different types of, but also different metal types, including precious ones. And this is part of the interest why we hear so much about e-waste, and I think that's part of why we are here today, because of your discussions in terms of circularity. On the side of generation, what we have been learning over the years is that e-waste generation is just growing, and here I put on the screen some numbers from a publication from ITU and UNEP, the Global Monitor report, where we can see big numbers. So for example, 62 million tons of e-waste was generated in the year 2022. That's definitely not little. And the news is that this is actually growing over time. Additionally, we hear that only about 20%, 22% has been collected and recycled in the world, which is very low. So we have a lot of space for improvement here. And finally, the value of the metals embedded in this e-waste accounts for about $90 billion, which is a high value. And therefore, part of this is why we keep on looking at e-waste, on how we improve the management of e-waste and how to improve the circularity of this. From the linkage of e-waste with the Basel Convention and why it also relates so much to that specific convention, we will cover some aspects specifically about the convention a bit later in the presentation. But the convention is about hazardous waste, and e-waste contains a lot of hazardous chemicals. So there are over 1,000 substances that are used in different types of e-waste, and e-waste also varies a lot in terms of definition. You have little cables to big machines, and these, and in between you have computers, mobile phones, refrigerators, air conditioning, and servers and the like. So e-waste is a vast area of work, and several of the substances listed here in my presentation are present in them, which makes the recycling on one hand interesting, but also dangerous on the other hand, because when you don't handle this e-waste in the proper way, you are creating problems for the environment and for the human beings. So for example, e-waste may contain heavy metals, which may be an interesting aspect for the recycling perspective, but also POPs such as PCBs and brominated flame retardants contained in plastics. So therefore, the recycling is not just a mechanical thing, and it's a dangerous area of work. And we keep on hearing that in the informal sector and seeing through pictures, videos, etc., that the informal sector especially uses methods such as open burning and in the recycling processes, and these are really sources of very dangerous chemicals for our health and also for our environment. So why the problem is a problem then? I just touched based on a few of these points, but because of this nature, which is on one hand a growing issue, but on the other hand, it's a source of valuable material, we have a lot of interest in trade of used equipment and also of e-waste. On the other hand, we also have illegal traffic happening because some players in the world are interested in doing that without any kind of control, and that can be a source of very negative consequences for the environment. We also observe that many countries are generating more and more e-waste, but they also lack the capacity to manage. So what's the solution for that then? How they're going to manage this huge generation of e-waste by themselves, but also from the source of export or import, depending on where you are in the world. And therefore, we need more options for a sustainable scenario in case we want to improve the situation, which I think is a common sense of all of us here. From the factual point of view, I mentioned the e-waste generation as one of the areas of generation that is growing, but in general, waste generation is growing. The population of our planet is growing. We are consuming more, countries are developing more, and therefore having access to more things, which is good. On the other hand, from the consumption point of view, this is becoming an management situation for all the countries. We are interested in circularity and in the recovery of materials, but we need to look into the linkages of e-waste and the other areas. As I mentioned, pollution, but also health, labor, the issue of gender in general. More women are working in the informal sector, human rights, and how these all play a role in the puzzle of e-waste. The good news is that we're observing that companies which are producing electronics are reducing the hazardous substances in them, but it's still there is still space for improvement. And from the Basel point of view, we observe, and Tatiana will mention some more examples as well, we see that there are problems for countries to implement the provisions of this convention in terms of the controls that are required under it, including the enforcement and the distinction of trade that is made in the area of e-waste, distinguishing e-waste from used equipment, and how to control that at the borders, how to control that from the environmental point of view. Now, a bit about the Basel Convention. Maybe some of you are familiar with that. Sorry about that. But for those who are not familiar with, this is an opportunity to get a quick overview. This is an international agreement, almost universal. So we have 191 countries which are parties to the convention. And the convention is over 30 years old. It's one of the eldest conventions in this field, in the area of environment. The main objective of the convention is to protect the human health and the environment, as I said before, against the adverse effects of hazardous wastes. And the scope of it which we in the Secretariat, but also everybody involved in this convention mentions about, is the annexes to the convention cover the scope of it, which has a list of hazardous waste and other waste which should be controlled by the mechanisms of this convention. The convention was created because there was a lot of unregulated movement of hazardous waste in the past, and those were causing issues in terms of environmental issues and affecting the countries which were receiving this e-waste without having the e-waste or any other types of waste, hazardous ones, that were affecting the environment where those wastes were eventually disposed of in an improper way. The convention has 3 pillars. I just mentioned one, but we also have the idea of minimizing the generation of hazardous wastes. So in terms of quantity and the degree of hazardousness. So this is happening in some areas, but not necessarily all together. And as I just mentioned, the generation of waste in general is growing. So we still have a lot of work to do in that, in changing the way we design products so that we minimize the generation of waste. I mentioned the second bullet point on the screen, which is the transboundary movement, imports and exports of waste controlled by the convention, and those should follow what we call the prior informed consent procedure, and Tatiana will cover that, which is the procedure to be respected by parties or by countries involved in the trade of the waste in the scope of the convention. And finally, the convention is also aiming at promoting what we call environmentally sound management of these types of wastes, which is one way to say that countries should manage these kinds of waste in a way that you respect the environment, the human health, and do that in a controlled way. Not, for example, not necessarily open burning these kinds of waste because of the releases of pollutants. Just to simplify very quickly. Here on the screen, you see a little timeline that shows several activities under this convention related to e-waste. So the convention was adopted in the 80s, at the end of the 80s. But after that, we had different activities taking place under it. In terms of partnerships, for example, we had the MPPI on mobile phones. We had another one called PACE, which is now more recently renamed PACE 2, and its scope has increased. So we have now more types of e-waste being tackled by this recent partnership. We also have guidance documents, the technical guidelines, which I will give you some details soon. We also are part of the e-waste coalition, which is a United Nations initiative to deliver on e-waste as a one. So we have a collaboration with different UN organizations in the area of e-waste, some looking from the labor point of view, health point of view, we looking from the environmental point of view and the likes. And more recently, and we will give more details about it, we had the adoption of the e-waste amendments in 2022, and these e-waste amendments will be entering into force in 2025. So this is a very important aspect for you to be aware of, because all your countries will be affected by that if they are parties to the convention. Now I'll just finalize my part of the presentation highlighting one of these activities, which is the technical guidelines on the transboundary movements of electrical and electronic waste and used equipment. So there were different versions of these guidelines. A guideline, just in simple terms for you, is the document negotiated by these countries, which are parties to the convention, aiming at improving this area of work. So parties got together to develop these guidelines because they know that this is an interesting and important issue for them, how to distinguish used equipment from e-waste and how to make the control of it more efficient, but also possible, since there is also an interest in trade. So different versions were adopted, and the latest one is from last year. Here is the list of items covered by these guidelines. Many initiatives refer to these guidelines, although it's a very short document. It contains a lot of important details for countries to understand these nuances of the distinction between waste and non-waste, the distinction between hazardous and non-hazardous waste, but also to do the control of the transboundary movements of e-waste. It also tries to indicate situations when used equipment should not be considered e-waste, and when it's kind of clear cut that the movement is talking about e-waste. Why is this important? Because there are different players in the world playing rightly the game and observing all the international laws and soft laws out there. This is an example of a soft law, so this is not law, but it's a document agreed at the international level. Therefore, countries are invited and should be following these principles as much as they can. But also because from the negative side, there are opportunities out there trying to export e-waste and call it used equipment. And that is creating environmental issues in the receiving countries. So that's why also the motivation to do such a document. But it's a difficult document because parties have, countries involved in this work, have different viewpoints. Some have stronger legislation, therefore their controls are better than others, and therefore it's not an easy topic for them to discuss. On the other hand, they managed to have this document, which is already a milestone for this convention, and it can always be improved. So I'll pass now the floor to Tatiana. Please, Tatiana, continue.
Thank you very much, Carla, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. So, one of the important objective of our webinar today is to talk about e-waste amendments, because these are the amendments which are not yet in force, but they're going to be in force in 2 months' time. And and when we talk about the e-waste amendment, we need to explain a little bit more the concept of the PIC procedure, which Carl already mentioned, the prior informed consent procedure. So, and this is really the foundation of the Basel Convention. So, so the PIC procedure is a procedure whereby countries involved or parties involved need to notify each other about the upcoming shipment of waste within the scope of the convention, and only when the consent is received from the country of import as well as the country of transit, then the shipment can take place. And if this procedure is not followed, or there is a deliberate purpose of dumping of waste, that would be considered illegal traffic under the convention. And then there is a specific article dealing with that. So, but we need to understand when to apply the PIC procedure. So the convention sets out very precise rules when the PIC procedure is to be applied. So it's to be applied to hazardous waste, which are listed in the convention in its several annexes. In particular, I would like to mention Annex 8, which really has various entries explaining the hazardous waste. For example, it could be medical waste, it could be waste contaminated with cadmium and so on. So you have this list of hazardous waste. The convention also adopted Annex 9, which lists non-hazardous waste. So, but this is just to help parties to determine what is hazardous and what is not. So, but non-hazardous waste, it's technically speaking outside of the scope of the convention. But now going back to when the PIC procedure applies, so it applies to hazardous waste listed in the convention. In addition, parties have the prerogative to define additional types of waste as hazardous in the national legislation. And in that case, the PIC procedure would also apply. So here you have this type of categories. And just from practice, we could say that some countries chose to define, for example, certain equipment older than a certain number of years, for example, 7 years or so on, as hazardous waste, meaning that for this type of old type of equipment, that would be considered hazardous for that particular country. The PIC procedure also applies to so-called other waste, and I know that perhaps for the broader audience, it's not so clear what is other waste, but this is other waste. It's a waste which requires special consideration. Those are listed in Annex 2. And these are waste which are not necessarily hazardous, meaning that they then do not necessarily are contaminated with hazardous constituents or demonstrate hazardous characteristics. But if they're not managed in an environmentally sound manner, they also lead to the adverse impact on human health and the environment. And currently, this list of so-called other waste, it was quite a short list. It included household waste, incineration from the household waste. But then more recently, parties decided to add mixed plastic waste, and those who are interested in the waste trade probably are very much aware of that addition. But also, it also now will be adding the non-hazardous e-waste. So that's also important point to make. And then, non-hazardous waste, they're not subject to the PIC procedure, meaning that the competent authorities of the parties concerned would not need to notify. So there are special forms, and then, for example, once the consent is received, then the party of expert would issue a movement document, which would need to accompany the shipment throughout its route until it's delivered to the country of import, to the company, for example, which will be treating this waste. And and then confirmation needs to be provided by this company that it has received and also dealt with according to the contract of this waste. Anyway, so this is the main this is the main points on the PIC procedure. Now, it's important to mention that some parties, so as you can see, that it's really controlling trade. It's not really banning trade, but some parties wanted actually to have a stricter controls, and there you have amendment to the convention, which became effective a few years ago, which is called ban amendment. So ban amendment, it applies to only to the hazardous waste, and in the non-legalistic language, it really means the ban of the export from the global north to the global south. The movement between the countries and or parties in the global north and the global south between each other are allowed, or the movements from the global south to the global north are also allowed, but from developed country to developing country, that's banned. So that's additional, let's say, layer of the controls which Basel Convention provides for. And if you can click again, Carla. And then in addition to that, convention also allows parties to adopt additional bans and restrictions, and it could be very nuanced, I would say. It can be either for import or either for export or for both, also for transit, and then also can be either for recovery or disposal. So on the national level, each individual party can adopt further restrictions and controls if, for example, it has a judgment, it judges that assessment that it doesn't have capacity to deal with a specific type of waste. Next one. Now, so that was the background to really lead us to the explanation what is really the meaning of the e-waste amendment. So the e-waste amendment was proposed by two countries, Ghana and Switzerland, and amendment to the convention were adopted in 2022, but parties decided to give some leeway to really prepare for this amendment to enter into force, which will become effective 1st of January 2025. And what that really means, these changes to the annexes, is that all transboundary movements, so all trade of e-waste, whether it's hazardous or non-hazardous, will be subject to the PIC procedure. And what it really also means is for the parties to prepare, is that they need to adjust or they need to amend their legislation to introduce these changes, but also they need to raise awareness of the private sector, of course, of the recycling industry, of the importers, exporters, everyone involved in this type of activities, as well as customs, because customs are the entities who will at the borders would need to understand and to check whether this trade is taking place in line with a convention or not. Next one. And here I know this is a bit of complicated with a lot of words, but this is just to give you an idea. About this amendment. So we basically have two entries. One entry on the left side, it's when e-waste is considered hazardous, and it's listed in Annex 8, and the entry is called A1181. And then on the right side, we have a mirror entry when e-waste is not considered to be hazardous. So it's a entry is called Y49, and it's Annex 2. And here you have a very similar language, but when it's hazardous, e-waste would be contaminated or containing various hazardous components, so constituents, for example, cadmium, lead, mercury, or other constituents which we have in the annex, to the extent that this e-waste will exhibit hazardous characteristic. And this is a classical definition of hazardous waste under the convention. Or it contains components in a similar way, contaminated with, for example, PCBs, certain circuit board, and so on. And if such components, such hazardous constituents are not included in the equipment and its components, then you can say that they are not hazardous. But what is important to mention is that the e-waste amendments are very clearly specify that we're talking about three categories of, let's say, e-waste. So the first is whole equipment. The second is components of e-waste. And the third one, which is sometimes maybe a little bit surprising, I heard such views from the industry, is actually waste which are coming from the processing of e-waste. So these are the fractions arising from shredding or dismantling. Next one. And this is in a nutshell. So from 1st of January, the peak procedure will be applicable to whole equipment, components, and the fractions from shredding. Okay, and here also a little bit of a recap about the trade control regime applicable to e-waste. And here we have a bit of a legal language from the Ban Amendment. But again, what it really means is that when we're talking about hazardous e-waste, so this entry A1181, there is a ban of export from the global north to the global south. However, the trade between countries in the global north is allowed with a peak procedure. The trade of e-waste in the global south of hazardous waste also allowed between the countries with a peak procedure, as well as if you move, for example, something from the country in Asia to Europe, again, it's allowed with a peak procedure. Now, when it comes to the non-hazardous e-waste, so entry Y49, so that's allowed. There's no really restrictions with the peak procedure. However, this is, I want to really underline that this is what is in line with the Basel Convention. We know that on the regional level, there are some stricter regimes. For example, European Union legislation is a very, I think, good example where there is a stricter regime of transboundary movement when it comes to the countries from the European Union. So, but what we have here is really what is allowed and not allowed under the Basel Convention. And here also we mentioned that some countries may decide to fully or partially prohibit import, transit, or export, or all, or impose an additional requirements. And again, this is allowed in accordance with the convention. So you can imagine it's quite a complex legal regime when it comes to the trade of e-waste. But just to say that, so that's what is coming up. But as Carla already mentioned, that e-waste is not a new issue for the Basel Convention. Back, 22 years ago, we already had parties were very concerned with e-waste, and of course, because of the development, the globalization, and way of life, the e-waste is still a big issue, a big environmental concern. But back in 2002, we had a partnership which was meant to support efforts of parties to treat, let's say, mobile phones in an environmentally sound manner. And that's one of the examples of the partnership. So that partnership was, and as well as the other partnership, they're open to parties, but also private sectors, NGOs, academia. So as long as entity demonstrates that it has some kind of relations to Basel Convention, it's very open. So you can become a member or observer to the partnership, and there are some activities going on. For example, in this partnership on mobile phones, the partnership developed a number of guidance documents on refurbishment of used phone collection, material recovery, awareness raising. Next one. Then there was another partnership which Carla already mentioned, that was specifically dealing with the computing equipment, and it was, let's say, open for 9 years because it has a mandate, and then it developed it delivered on its mandate and delivered a number of various activities, including guidance documents specifically on computing equipment. Next one. And I will not go into the very details, but I think what is important, and currently this partnership was reestablished in a way. It was revamped with a bigger, stronger mandate and broader mandate. So it now covers all e-waste, and it also now looking at the refrigerators, cooling and heating equipment, TV screens, and also it has various activities, pilot project, dissemination activities, and it reaches up to actually over 500 entities, because it also has some of its members are networks. So, but the main focus of this partnership, environmentally sound management, not so much trade, but the environmentally sound management of e-waste. Next one. Yes, and I would like to just finish off with this couple of points. So you can imagine that even the convention is 30 years ago, and the reality 30 years ago were very different. But convention is actually live in a way, and it can adapt to the new realities. And here I would like to mention two track of work which could be interesting, because they will have also implication on the e-waste trade. So one of them is the new process established to it's kind of negotiation to improve the function of the peak procedure, because while the system is there, the rules are there, the way you implement it, that could be perhaps sometimes not always efficient, so sometimes there are delays. So, and that way, that was the reason why parties decided to get together and collect information on challenges, best practices, approaches, initiative to see how to improve the peak procedure. And just 2 weeks ago, the group of parties, it was there is a small group negotiating, discussing these issues, met again and develop a set of recommendations, which will be put for consideration by the next conference of the parties in May in Geneva. And some of the consideration include how to make this process, the decision making, faster and more simple, whether parties want to put some specific deadlines by when different countries will have to respond to each other, because now the deadlines are not specifically, there. And so we'll see. So it's, of course, at the end of the day, it's up to the parties to decide how they want to improve the procedure. And so that's the one. And then the next, another track of work, which also I would like to mention, and I think also it will have implication on e-waste in future. That is very much linked to the first process, which I just mentioned, but that is more technical part. It's basically digitalization of the peak procedure in a way. So now we still work with parties still work with movement documents, with various forms. Some parties actually require even hard copies, some accept emails and so on. But here the purpose is to see whether the convention can come up with a system where the peak procedure can be done electronically. And this is another process, and it's a step-by-step approach, of course. And the mandate is to develop report with recommendations and on the next step. And here again, like in the previous work stream, you have a small intersessional working group. There are members, which are parties, but also there are observers. So observer to the Basel Convention can also become observer to these groups to be part of the discussions about this important topic. And then I would like just to finish with the fact that, of course, many efforts need to be done to really prepare for the e-waste amendment enter into force. We just mentioned partnership here as one of the examples, but also we have a technical assistant program, and we have been organizing a number of regional workshops to help parties to prepare for this significant change in the trade control regime on e-waste. And just last month, we organized together with Carla a regional workshop in Bangkok for around 20 countries where we discuss what is needed to prepare for the e-waste amendment, and that was for the Basel Convention competent authority, but also customs. But of course, much more is needed, and our presentation today is one of our efforts as well to raise awareness about these policy developments or policy changes which are coming up. I think with that, I would like to finish my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carla and Tatiana, for that excellent and quite comprehensive overview of the legal framework, global legal framework for e-waste. Carla, thanks for giving the context of e-waste as a waste stream and this legal framework that provides for the procedure, the processes, and of course the partnerships. Now, what struck me the most first was the 3 pillars that you mentioned, which is quite robust and comprehensive, but also direct and straight to the point, right? We have what you said, minimizing more upstream and control of transboundary movements of hazardous waste, and more downstream on the promotion of environmentally sound management of hazardous waste, which is important for the circular economy context. And then for Tatiana, thank you so much, really, for providing the procedures. In the context of e-waste and transboundary has a movement of waste. This PIC, or the prior informed consent procedure, is really the heart of it all. And if it's not followed, then it would amount to illegal trafficking that, as you said. And there are so many updates here. You mentioned the e-waste amendments and also the technical guidelines that the BRS conventions have produced on this. So we're looking forward to how this plays out. But thank you again, Tatiana and Carla. And I just want to ask all the audience here, if you have questions, please feel free to put them on the question box. And if you also are comfortable, we can also have you ask directly asking the panelists here with us. But before that, let me just draw attention on what you said, Carla, on the e-waste and its linkages with so much more, like the environment, particularly pollution, health, labor, gender, and human rights. And this is precisely why it's important to relate this to the circular economy to address all these, as well as eliminate or minimize its potential adverse impacts. So very, very important point. So right now we have like a good panel with us. I can start the questions if there aren't any, but please feel free to jump in if you have any questions for both of our panelists from the Basel Convention. Maybe I'll ask the both of you first on some some updates on the technical guidelines. For instance, these technical guidelines are very important for national governments, especially on the interpretation of the annexes, as you've mentioned, Tatiana. And would you give us a brief background on how you're helping many developing countries in implementing these technical guidelines at the national level, and what have been the challenges so far that we can help address? Maybe we can start there.
Shall I do that?
Sure, Carla.
Yeah, so as I shortly mentioned, this is one of the lines of work under the convention. So they developed these so-called technical guidelines on the trade of used equipment and e-waste. And used equipment is outside of the scope of the convention. And one may think, why is it there? It's because of the reasons that I mentioned, because there are movements of used equipment being done in the world for repair, for recovery, for recycling. But in some occasions, some of this is actually used to disguise waste. And then from the side of the recipient countries, this can become a complex situation, especially for countries which don't have the capacity or the interest in those kinds of electronic equipment and e-waste. So the countries have been working over now 20 years on this, almost, and 19 years, if I'm not mistaken, and different, as Tatiana mentioned, in the groups under the Basel Convention that develop any kind of product, such a guideline or guidance, normally there are negotiations among them, and they have different perspectives. That was not different for these guidelines either. So here we had a group of parties, countries, and also the US, for example, which is a non-party to this convention, but is a big player in there of trade in the world, and also representatives of NGOs and the industry, showing their different perspectives. So if you are an industry that is, let's say, doing the job as you are supposed to do, you are interested in having controls which are aligned with your business and vice versa. You don't want an over-controlling system so that you can block the trade or disturb the trade. And that's one of the discussions. The other is this definition that keeps on being asked. How can you define e-waste and used equipment? How can you distinguish them at the time when you are requesting to import or export, but also at the time at the border, as customs will have to deal with that on the spot. So there are different mechanisms that parties try to reflect on these guidelines to help in the different phases of the trade. So there are documents that are referred to for being prepared for those who want to export, to prove that this is one type of thing or the other, and also the way that they are packaged, and so characteristics of the trade and how that should physically take place, so that it's easy to identify whether this is e-waste or electronic equipment or used equipment, and also some indication of how customs should look into it if they have to control that. And if they're faced, let's say, with a container full of something, how can they easily see whether this is legal or illegal? Is this what the paper is saying is what is in they're seeing face to face? So these guidelines is being revised in that sense. And but there are controversial issues out there, because what Tatiana mentioned, some countries want to restrict more, others are more flexible, some are more interested in trades, others are interested in prohibiting everything because they don't have the capacity. So these are all behind the development and update of these guidelines. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Carla. And I'll go over to Tatiana, but maybe I'll pin one more question there to include the e-waste amendment. As you said, it's going to be entered into force 2 months from now, start of 2025, and that will necessitate a lot of legal and policy reform, legislation perhaps. What might be needed for national countries, and how does the BRS Secretariat assist in the transposition of these requirements into national law? So you might have some thoughts there, Tatiana. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. I think this is one of the critical questions actually for many countries. Perhaps just to start with the fact that e-waste, it's a bit a special waste compared to other waste. For example, nowadays plastic waste is also very much, everyone is talking about it because there is also a global treaty being negotiated. But e-waste, it's special because it has precious metals, it has some available materials, but also has hazardous components. And that's why now for all this year, there have been so much interest to e-waste. But also it's special because I think it has it could be really have an interesting demonstration, or actually very like real demonstration of circular economy. Because this is what we don't want to mine the new elements from the earth, right? We want to encourage urban mining, which is also better for the climate change perspective. So, but then of course, on the other hand, you also have these challenges as we have been discussing. And what Carla also mentioned, I think the technical guidelines, which is a critical document. So that the technical guidelines seek to help parties to distinguish between, to solve the issue of waste, non-waste, and then e-waste amendment seek to help parties to deal with the issue hazardous, non-hazardous. So these are the two let's say, different aspects of this issue. Now, in terms of what is needed for parties to be prepared for this new regime, yes, first of all is updated legislation. Second is training custom officials, but also I would say maybe stepping back a little bit is really to understanding the situation in the country when it comes to the e-waste. And for that, what could be useful to do is to do the inventory of e-waste. And we do have the guidance document and guidance materials to help parties to develop such inventory, because inventory would be a snapshot of what is going on the ground. For example, what are your capacity, recycling capacity? What are your disposal capacity? Not all the parties have actually capacity to recycle circuit boards, because these are highly specialized. So there are several facilities in the world, and then it's this type of components would be perhaps moved somewhere else. So, but also, also what is the generation rate? How much your country generates e-waste? What is the import-export volumes? So you need to have a full understanding what is going on the ground, and then to also to make a policy decision. And I think once you have this data, you can have an informed policy decision to decide what is important for your country, also keeping in mind maybe economic consideration, social consideration, and formal sector, what Carla mentioned, is also a big issue for some countries. So it could be hundreds and thousands of people involved in that. So how to formalize with the informal sector. So there are many issues, I think, to be considered. But in terms of what the BRS Secretariat can do, can help with. So on one hand, we have as you can, I think, figure out the whole range of the guidance documents, and we just presented one of them. The guidance which I mentioned about inventory is another one, and then we'll have many other documents to help to update legislation. For example, we have a guidance document dedicated for customs, for enforcement entities. So that is one thing which parties can really tap into all these resources. Then we have a technical assistance program, and there you have opportunities for parties, but also for others to participate in technical assistance activities in terms of the, let's say, training workshops, but also projects. So there could be also national level projects. Of course, we're not well, Secretariat, we're not a big agency which would be dealing with many big projects, but we still do quite a few projects. For example, on plastic waste, we have over 65 projects on plastic waste. On e-waste, not so many, but there are opportunities. Of course, it will also involve some fundraising and so on. Then you have HS codes, for example, and work with WCO, where we have a direct cooperation there. And then you have a HS code for e-waste specifically, which was, let's say, applicable, adopted 2022. Then you have partnerships and other. So you have various areas how we can help parties, but also in addition to that, we can also link interested parties to other agencies, because you can also have a bigger projects, for example, through the other agencies. We have UNEP, UNIDO, other organization also working on that, ITU, and yeah, so I think we have a various way how we could help parties to deal with the e-waste.
Right. Thanks. Great points, Tatiana. The assistance needed is more like regulation and legislation, but as well as capacity building and training for enforcement officials, customs, as you said, as well as the data needed. The inventories are very important for all these recycling capacity, for instance. Now, thanks for that. And I just want to invite anyone, if you have any questions, please feel free to jump in. But for now, maybe I'll connect to what you said, Tatiana, on these capacity for recycling, for instance. One of the downstream measures and the intent of the Basel Convention is to have environmentally sound management of waste. And, are there any initiatives on e-waste specific, for instance, infrastructure, maybe points of collection, like recycling measures? What are the guidelines or maybe like practices that you've been seeing, and how can this be applied in many developing country contexts that might be quite interesting for many of our colleagues here at the bank?
Well, I could perhaps start, and if maybe Carla could add something. So I think, and that's I think also quite interesting consideration, given that we are in the Asian Development Bank webinar, and I think important point to mention that in our technical assistance activities, we don't really deal with infrastructure. So that's really would not be directly within our mandate. And we do focus more on the legislation, on the training, but also, as you said, environmental sound management. We have, again, quite a few policy elements, for example, to develop a national environmental sound management strategy. We have various manuals. So what is considered to be environmentally sound management, because it's you can imagine that there are various technologies around there. But when it comes to the infrastructure and building, let's say, recycling facility and so on, so that would be not really within our scope of work. And I think it's a great opportunity today that we are here, and perhaps there could be some other actors who could pick up this type of activities, and maybe in cooperation with us or other UN agencies to really to see how to help countries. But I think, yeah, but overall maybe it's just, yeah, it's very important to have the overall picture and really understand what is needed to do, before maybe jumping into the building capacity facilities, because e-waste is so complex. And what also I heard, for example, just a couple, because we had another big workshop in South Africa for African countries, and then we had a global industry talking to us about their perspective, and then they mentioned that in the more recent electronics, there is a less precious metals being used to optimize. So, and that means that it's even more difficult to organize efficient recycling. So it really has to be very specialized recycling, because you have these very complex components. Yeah. So I think maybe with that, I don't know if Carla has anything to add.
Carla?
No, it's just that I would say, as Tatiana explained, we have limited capacity. We're not a development bank or a big agency. It's a small secretariat, but we do work with different partners in the different regions. So specifically in your region, we have what we call the regional centers, and they are partners implementing pilot projects in general. Those pilot projects show needs from the different countries that are involved in this project, but also can test a few elements of what is embedded either in the convention or in the documents or products generated by the convention, such as guidance and so on, to test whether countries are in the right track or whether there is space for improvement in certain areas, including recycling and so on. So under the PACE 2, for example, there are countries working on different projects trying to see whether EPR, for example, is a system that should be used more broadly. It seems that people are more in the consensus area on that. But of course, there are challenges. That EPR cannot be the solution for all. But this is just one example of activities that we do through the convention, in this case, specifically under the PACE 2 partnership, to help countries implement EPR, and perhaps they start in a smaller region, and then that can become a potential for the overall coverage in a country, for example.
Yep. Great points. Thank you, Carla and Tatiana, for those. Any last questions from the audience? If not, maybe I'll go to this one point, which might be of interest because we're looking at solutions, and ADB is quite keen to support technological solutions and advancements in circular economy space. You mentioned, Tatiana and Carla, that you are looking at the digitalization of the prior informed consent procedures, for example. And what might be these solutions that you're looking at, especially as to transparency of the waste movements, maybe traceability on how you can see how these waste is going from one jurisdiction to another. So any points on that? Just quickly on solutions, please.
So I'll try to answer that. So Tatiana and I, we facilitate these two works that she mentioned in her part of the presentation. So she's helping the group looking into the business or the legal part of the PIC procedure, seeing where are the opportunities to improve that. And I'm helping the group looking into the use of technology to support the PIC procedure. What we see in the world is that there are many countries already using technology, but I would say the biggest number is the number of countries that do not have yet technology helping them. And technology here, I mean very simple things. For example, having a system in place where the Ministry of Environment or the environmental agency can look into the request for import and export in an automated way, instead of fax, instead of email. And then, someone goes on holiday, nobody listens or checks the email account. So we are looking into basic ways of managing information and how that could be more automated with the help of software and hardware. And the group is discussing whether, for example, for countries that already have a customs initiative, software helping customs work, whether this system supporting the Basel should be connected to that and how. Whether we also should have one single solution for the whole world to connect to, and then everybody would do trade through that kind of platform. So the group is still in the early stages, but based on the surveys and on the analysis we have done so far, we see that there is a lot of interest in that area because people believe that technology, and you can prove that in some occasions, that you can have first better management of information, but also more traceability, as you just said, more transparency. And when any kind of document that starts in the beginning of an export or import can be available for all the players in the whole life cycle of that process, which facilitates what we just said, transparency, traceability, but also the management of having. So it's more efficient to work in that way. But based on what will be discussed under the PIC procedure itself, the system should reflect what the business and the legal parts will be deciding. So if, for example, there is a time limit for a specific trade to take place, which is one of the complaints under the PIC procedure, saying, it takes too long, it's complicated, it involves so many people and so many countries and so on. So technology may be able to help them make it in a more concrete way, an efficient way, and time limits will be more efficiently respected, most likely. So these are perhaps very concrete examples for you on how that, but both works are still in the beginning. So we have to see next year. So next year's COP is very interesting. So if you can come, you will see a lot of these exciting discussions there.
Right. Thank you, Carla. I think that was comprehensive. Tatiana, just maybe quickly on that.
Yeah, and by the way, just what Carla mentioned about the CAP, if there is also ADB has some initiative which would be of relevance to the Basel Convention, there's also space at the side event to present also ADB and to help to connect. But just to quickly mention on traceability, EU-waste amendment also meant to improve that, because then environmental authority will be involved, and then they will have to actually report transboundary movements to the Secretariat under the national reporting. And we have that's the public information where you can actually you will be able to see the amounts of waste being imported, exported, and so on. We have a dashboard where you can see that. So that's current information which is available. But of course, what we mentioned about these new processes, this is something which we're really looking forward to, because it will also greatly improve the traceability and transparency.
So looking forward to that, Tatiana, next year and beyond. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I noted that there's a question here, but we'll keep in touch with you, and we'll keep in touch with the panelists to give you answers for these questions. As we close this program, I'd like to thank Carla and Tatiana for their insightful overview of the e-waste within the Basel Convention's framework and how this can contribute to circular economy. Just some updates. We will share the presentations and video session in our data sharing platform page. So please make sure to check that out at the ADB Data Room Circular Economy ADB Knowledge Event Repository. And importantly, before we leave, please don't forget to fill up the evaluation form for this webinar, as your feedback is important for us to improve our series. So fortunately, we don't have much time for today, but thank you to everyone for all the participants joining. I hope this webinar has offered invaluable insights on how we can navigate and potentially finance initiatives towards a circular economy in the context of e-waste and beyond. Again, this has been Rocky Guzman from the ADB. Thanks for tuning in this afternoon, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.